مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. ضرب الإرهاب ضرباته في مانهاتن، ومثل ما حدث في نيس وبرلين ولندن والقدس كان السلاح سيارة وليس سلاحا ناريا أو قنبلة، ولكن جاءت النتائج قاتلة. في أفغانستان يختبئ عناصر القاعدة في الكهوف، وفي سوريا والعراق الدولة الإسلامية تنكمش حجما وقوة، ولكن ما يزال الإرهابيين يملكون القدرة على توجيه ضربات في قلب أمريكا. اتبع الرئيس بوش استراتيجية في عصر ما بعد 11 سبتمبر تقضي بتطبيق العدالة على الإرهابيين بكامل قوى أمريكا الآتية. واتبع الرئيس أوباما استراتيجية مختلفة طوال العقد التالي، حيث ركز على الطائرات دون طيار والصواريخ والقوات الخاصة لاستهداف أعدائنا. انتهج الرئيس ترامب نهجا مختلفا عن سلفه، حيث حاول منع دخول أي متطرف يشتبه بأمره إلى البلاد، ومعهم الكثيرون من غير المتطرفين. هل سيحقق نجاحا أكبر؟ أم أن الإرهاب جزء من النسيج المؤسف لحياتنا المعاصرة؟ لمناقشة استراتيجية أمريكا المتطورة حيال الإرهاب والدور الذي يلعبه الإرهاب في سياستنا الخارجية إجمالا، يسرني أن أرحب بواحد من أشهر الصحفيين الاستقصائيين في واشنطن، وهو ريتشادر مينيتر. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. So, terror again has struck in the heart of America's largest city, New York City. What does it mean? Is ISIS a broader phenomenon than one just restricted to Syria and Iraq? Or is this an outlier? Is America's counterterrorism strategy, now in our third administration after September 11, is our strategy working? And what needs to be fixed? Today, I'm delighted to welcome Rich Minitor, who has followed this issue for many years. Delighted to have you on our show.
Oh, good to be here.
So tell us, how should we view the New York vehicular attack that killed 8?
One of the things we should look at is homegrown or American-based radicalization. This is someone who came to the United States and by all accounts in 2010 was not a radical. He became a radical inside the United States. This is something that counterterrorism experts have known about for decades. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who planned the 9/11 attacks, the September 11 attacks, was radicalized in North Carolina in 2 different American universities there. There are many other examples of leading terrorist figures who were radicalized either in Europe or in the United States. And it's time for us to start looking at why people become radicalized inside the United States. The CIA has done in-depth research on the demographics of terrorists, who becomes a terrorist and why. Mental disorder has almost nothing to do with it. In fact, although terrorism is a profoundly antisocial activity, major terrorist organizations don't seem to tolerate people with mental disorders. The rate of psychosis inside terrorist groups, if you especially look at Guantanamo Bay populations, but other sample populations, much lower than the average population. So it's not psychosis, it's some deeply felt psychological need. We know that most people who join terrorist organizations are recruited outside their home country. Most come from intact middle-class families. Most are among the best and the brightest in their society. If they're coming from the Arab world and are radicalized elsewhere. The European recruits, people who convert to Islam after joining a terrorist organization, are a different demographic, less educated, less upwardly mobile, fewer prospects in life. But for the people like the man accused, mowing down more than a dozen people, killing and injuring on the bike path in New York. He fits the profile of someone who is very promising coming from the Muslim world in terms of education, ability, adjustment to society, who then becomes radicalized inside the United States. And what this means is that terrorism is really an American problem and needs to be addressed.
So when you say it's an American problem, do we view this as an Islamic State attack in the United States? Do we view this, or should we view this as what the term of art of a lone wolf, somebody who on his own was radicalized, perhaps just by the internet? What's the right way of, right lens through which to view this?
Well, we don't know that he was a lone wolf because absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld likes to say. Just because we can't establish that this person was connected to Al-Qaeda or other jihadi groups doesn't mean that he wasn't in contact with them through some other means. Signal intelligence, the ability to intercept phone calls, look at electronic messages. It's much harder inside the United States due to the constitutional protections, not just for U.S. citizens, but for U.S. residents and for U.S. visitors. So even a visitor to the United States has a lot of constitutional protections, and it's very hard for the police or intelligence services to listen in on their phone calls or look at their electronic communications. So it's too soon to say whether this person is a lone wolf, someone who radicalized on their own, or someone who's connected to a larger terrorist organization. Also, ISIS is not like Al-Qaeda. ISIS tends to take credit for attacks in which it has really no role. The Las Vegas shooting, for example, ISIS claimed credit for the attack 3 separate times, but there's no credible evidence that they were involved in any way. So
we've seen some jihadists in the United States that come from unusual backgrounds, at least unusual from the sense of most Americans. The Boston Marathon bombers were from Chechnya. Mm-hmm. This alleged terrorist in New York from Uzbekistan. We've seen examples from the Somali community in mm-hmm. Minneapolis. What does this say about the spread of this sort of radical ideology in various communities in the United States, and what is the antidote to
Well, I think your question is pointing to the ultimate origins of these immigrants to the United States, which is where the Trump administration is focused. But I think that's really the wrong focus, because we know, for example, the Boston bombers, the Sonarno brothers, were not radicals when they came here. They became radicals here inside the United States. And so we have to ask ourselves this question. What is it about joining a terrorist organization that solves an important problem in someone's life? And there's a lot of research to suggest that it's a lot like joining a criminal gang. People join the Crips, the Bloods, the other criminal gangs, MS-13 in the United States, to satisfy...
These are urban criminal gangs in major American cities related to narcotics trafficking and other crimes.
Which have no ideology.
No ideology, right.
Right. But they're incredibly violent and destructive. In fact, they kill more people than terrorists inside the United States. By far, right. But people join these organizations, and some of them join these gangs through intimidation, but many join through a psychological need. There's a missing father, a desire for a sense of belonging, a desire for the safety of a group, psychological safety of a group. And we know that people join terrorist organizations, and I'm talking about Salafi organizations now, for a bundle of reasons. Profound one is alienation, that they are disconnected with the people around them, and they wish to connect in a way that doesn't lead to humiliation of themselves. The classic example is Muhammad Atta, when I was at the Sunday Times of London.
Remind our viewers who Muhammad Atta is?
Muhammad Atta was the lead pilot, if you will, on the September 11th attacks, and famously photographed boarding the plane in Maine to connect in Boston and then drive his plane into the World Trade Center. When I was at the Sunday Times of London investigative team, we sent reporters and private investigators into Germany, where he had studied, to look into his background. And we discovered that he had a terrible relationship with women. He had been an Egyptian student who had transferred to Germany, and he had most of his education in Egypt had been single sex. He was surrounded by boys. And suddenly he was a first-year college student at 18 in Germany in a co-ed environment. and he interacted with German girls the way a 14-year-old boy might, and 18-year-old German girls did not take that interaction kindly and kind of actually tended to avoid him. So he felt alienated, and he searched for a human connection. Ultimately, he went to a mosque, not out of religious devotion, because he wasn't particularly religious at this point in his life, but looking for someone like him that he could talk to, that he could befriend, that he could connect with. And Muhammad Atta's bad luck, and ours, was that he did find someone there who was a recruiter for a terrorist organization. But many foreign students, who attend mosques just find a kind ear and develop real friendships. But unfortunately, sometimes they find terrorist recruiters. And it solves an important problem in their lives. It gives them a sense of belonging, it gives them a role. And there are stages to this recruitment process, and where initially it's just eating together. Then it's keeping halal together and appointing someone in the 4-person group to do the shopping and the cooking, someone else to lead the prayers. People get roles inside the organizations. As the organization, that little unit matures, the recruiter gives it larger and larger tasks. Secrecy is introduced, covering the windows, secure communication, sometimes travel to overseas training facilities, and then intermarriage. They like cell members to marry each other's sisters, which forces them to stay inside the group. And so by the time the process is complete and it's time to carry out the attack, 4, 5, even 8 years might have passed. And you, as the terrorist, all of your only source of income is the terrorist cell. Your family is you're literally intermarried into the cell. All of your close friends are members of the cell. To walk away from that and not carry out the suicide attack is emotionally almost impossible. Many do, by the way. Not all the suicide attacks are carried out, but the ones that are carried out are because of these incredible psychological ties. So we really need to look at this as a psychological issue, not to say they're psychotic, but because there's people searching for a need. One last thought on this. Everyone who's radicalized inside the United States attends a civilian American university or college. Nobody who's attended an American military academy has been radicalized. And the answer for that is that because the military academies, they take a much more greater interest in the psychological life of their students and to build a sense of belonging and that you are part of a team. That civilian universities tend to leave people on their own, and some people flounder and fail and feel left out and go seeking other options.
Very interesting. Now, you've written books about, on the other end of the policy agenda, you've written books about how various administrations, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, have handled their counterterrorism strategy. Take a look at the Trump administration. We're only 9 or so months in, but what sort of judgments can you draw about its approach to dealing with this problem?
Well, I think there are, a number of counterterrorism mistakes that we've already seen in the Trump administration. One is this focus on origins rather than on what kind of radicalization happens here inside the United States. Oddly enough, the U.S. government has much more control of what happens inside the United States, and they never seem to focus on that. They always want to focus on these so-called bad Muslim countries. I was in Khartoum recently when the Trump administration lifted its travel ban for Sudanese. And what the Sudanese found astonishing is that they were ever on that list to begin with. They had been cooperating with U.S. foreign policy initiatives and with intelligence initiatives and with counterterrorism for about 15 years. And so they don't know why they got listed and they don't know why they got delisted. Another failing in the Trump counterterrorism policy is its failure to, and we saw the same thing in the Obama and the Bush years, failure to engage with tribes. There's this foolish notion inside the U.S. State Department that tribes are not important entities, that tribes are, in fact, these primitive sidelights. But in fact, for much of the Arab world, and the non-Arab world for that matter, tribes are incredibly important drivers of both political parties and political movements, but also how individuals see themselves and what kinds of decisions they will make. And the State Department and the CIA and the intelligence services generally don't really give any thinking to tribes, and don't try to engage with tribes.
Rich, hold that thought, and we'll come back to a deeper discussion of what the U.S. government is and isn't doing right in its fight against terrorism after the break in just a moment. Our guest again today is Richard Minitor. Rich is an award-winning investigative journalist, best-selling author, and Chief Executive Officer of the American Media Institute, a nonprofit organization that provides investigative stories to media outlets. A former national security columnist for Forbes and editorial page writer for the Wall Street Journal, he was a member of the highly regarded investigative team of the Sunday Times of London. Rich is the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books. Lots of people just like to have one. They were Losing Bin Laden, Shadow War, and Leading from Behind. And his articles have appeared in all the best places, from the New York Times to Atlantic Monthly to Newsweek. Born in New York City, he received his undergraduate degree at Vassar College. So let's just continue this discussion for a minute. You referred to two faults so far of administration counterterrorism strategy. Is there anything that we're doing especially right in this arena?
Absolutely. One of the most interesting things that's been going on quietly in Guantanamo, for example, is putting together these genealogical charts of they finally figured out that terrorist organizations are highly influenced by family structures. And when you capture during World War II a member of the Wehrmacht, you know from the rankings on the arm of his uniform where he stands in the organization. But when you capture someone from Al-Qaeda or ISIS or a related Salafi organization, you really don't know. And finding out that this is the favored son of the favored wife is much more important, and that is the kind of thing you can only do through genealogical charts and through intense cooperation with Arab intelligence services. There are a number of Arab services that have opened offices in Guantanamo, and this has really helped the counterterrorism process. First of all, it's helped the U.S. make better decisions about who to release and who to keep, but it's also helped the interrogators ask smarter questions, and it's also driven in Iraq, for example, a focus on capturing people who actually make a difference in determining the future of terrorist organizations.
Let me ask you sort of a big picture question about terrorism. Is this a fact of American life, or is this something that in fact we can stamp out like we stamped out polio?
It's not something we can stamp out like polio. It's almost older than polio in a way. I know polio goes back to the beginning of the human race, but certainly terrorism in its modern form begins with Russian anarchists in the 1840s. We saw terrorist attacks both in Europe and the United States. John Brown, for example, the abolitionist, in the eve of the Civil War, American Civil War in 1860. John Brown's speech, if you were to change a few biblical references, could have been given by Osama bin Laden in some ways, right? The same fury at perceived injustice, the same idea that large chunks of humanity should be dispensed with in order to bring about a just new world, the utter self-confidence in the authoritarian nature of these kind of things. This is something that maybe is Russia's gift to Western civilization. But it's something the Arab world, by the way, comes fairly late to. 1930s is when we start to see real terrorist activity. And in the beginning, the Arabs are the victims of terrorism, not the perpetrators of terrorism. One of the problems of the Trump administration and the key people there is they seem to think of terrorism as some sort of Arab invention that is somehow a result of Islam or radical Islam. It is a profoundly Western invention, and it'll be with us for quite some time, even after the Salafi movements are ultimately defeated. Do I think that it's possible to defeat Al-Qaeda and ISIS and various Salafi groups on the ground in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere? Absolutely. In fact, the United States has done something similar before in the Philippines with the Haq Rebellion in the early 20th century. The British did it very effectively in the Malay Emergency in the 1950s in what is now called Malaysia. It can be done, and it can be done without terrorizing the civilian population, without authoritarianism and brutality. It can be done. but it will recur because this political tool connects very well with a defect in human nature.
All right, let's move to a different part of who you are and what you are a specialist in, and that is being an investigative reporter. Why is investigative reporting such an important part of journalism, and do we do it well? What do we need to do better at?
Well, you know, investigative reporting used to be a redundancy, right? Everyone investigated if they're going to report, right? And now almost no one does. There's a lot of recycling of press releases. The reason why it's important is in a free society, in any society that's going to grow, it needs to question itself. And it needs to ask hard questions of government officials, of business leaders, of union leaders, of anyone in civic life. This constant questioning of institutions is done by people like me. And what we've looked at through the long span of human history is societies that question themselves intensely grow more quickly, become more politically powerful, become more successful, and actually have a higher standard of living in most cases than societies that don't question themselves. There is an alarming trend in American life, and we see this across Western Europe, we see this in Australia, throughout Western civilization, of shutting down critics, of coming to a place of conformity. And that, if that were to take hold, would lead to the downfall of our society.
That's a pretty big charge for investigative journalists to protect the
well,
fate
we're not
of Western
the only
civilization.
ones. We're not the only ones questioning. I mean, but what we used to see in the academy among the professors, a far more critical crowd. In fact, we find a kind of dull conformity among most academics. There's this odd institution in America, the think tank, in which people who are, initially were people who were directly connected to academic institutions, but now most think tanks are made up of people in Washington. These are groups of independent minds who do research and write papers and try to influence and educate in public life. But they're not universities, they don't teach students. And the fact that so many of these people who are some of the brightest and best contributors in Washington and around the world are not welcomed into universities anymore because their ideas are seen as too divisive or too big or too dangerous is a bad sign for the future of universities.
Yes, no, as a director of a think tank, I couldn't agree with you more on that. And do you get any news from electronic media?
Yes, I mean most of my news comes from electronic media. For North Korea, I look at NK Daily, which is a Seoul-based English language news service. Fascinating detail on the politics and economics inside North Korea. It's a nice check on some of the uninformed reporting you see in Western media. I look at the Sunday Times and the Times of London and some of the other British press extensively because they tend to pick up information we don't. I'll look at the websites, The Nation in Pakistan, for example, very useful for understanding the AFPAC relationship, and it's accessible in English. It's important to read widely, and if you're not seeing enough contrary points of view, go looking for them. They're out there, and sometimes they're well informed, and sometimes they'll change your mind.
Excellent. Excellent advice for our readers from Rich Minitor, one of Washington's premier experts on counterterrorism and even more broadly, investigative journalism. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Washington. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول الاستراتيجية الأمريكية لمحاربة الإرهاب على الصعيدين المحلي والدولي، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.